Welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to re-energise as we have lots more content to cover. Let's move on to our last panel of the morning, adaptation to climate change. Climate change, as we know, causes extreme weather conditions, heavy rainfall, storms, heat waves, cold snaps, high winds, all of which can threaten safety, cause damage to infrastructure, and of course, massive disruption to services. Another consideration is that as climate change worsens, the frequency and intensity of extreme weather will likely increase. So the industry needs to start adapting and modifying its operations to minimize the impact of adverse weather. Within the active approach to adapting to the challenges ahead, the industry needs to ensure the safety of workers and passengers whilst considering the most cost-effective approach to a resilient railway. To help us explore this important and pressing topic, I'm joined by Dr. Brian Haddock, Seasons and Climate Specialist for Transport Modes at Network Rail, Tim Foster, Interim Strategy and Programme Director at Transport for the North, and Hayley Warrens, Climate Risk and Resilience Lead at Transport for Wales. Now, don't forget to submit any questions you have for our panellists in the live Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen. We had lots of questions for the last panel, so I'm hoping that lots will flow through for this. Good morning, everybody. This morning has absolutely raced by. I didn't even really have time to say hello to you properly in the green room beforehand, but thank you for being with us. I mean, in the rail industry in the past, we've joked, haven't we, about, leaves on the line. That was the old sort of British rail, leaves on the line, so services are disrupted. But, as the world faces the urgent pressures now of climate change and the climate change emergency, I'd just like to ask you all what you think the climate change impacts are that are likely to affect the rail industry. So maybe Hayley, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Helen. I mean, it will vary regionally. So some impacts may be more intensified in some regions than others, particularly in upland regions. So there will be more of a natural propensity to flood. But the current projections are actually indicating that precipitation is going to increase in intensity and in its frequency, particularly during the winter. The recent IPCC report has stated that could be as much as 18%. Now, again, that will vary around the world. But the Committee on Climate Change, they've actually indicated that it is possible by the middle of the century that rainfall will be 5% more in the winter. Now, what that will mean is, particularly for the region where I work, flooding will be a key issue, particularly in the Core Valley line. So that is a network in Transport for Wales. So there's a lot of the track is in close proximity to the rivers because historically settlements have been built close to the rivers, and all that water is going to do when it reaches the sort of the hills and the valleys, it wants to find its way to the river, and quite often it has to cross the track in order to do so. So I think flooding is going to be a major issue. There are possibilities of very intense heat waves. They will be happening more frequently than what they're doing, particularly these 10-year heat wave events. So there is a possibility that by 2040, temperatures of 32 degrees will be really commonplace. Now, by 2080, 2100, in this possible 4-degree scenario, I think it's possible that 40-degree temperatures will be common in the UK. What that's going to bring is risk to our networks in terms of buckling, overhead line sagging, equipment failures, but then also heat risk to our staff and our passengers as well. And then we've also got some of our network is along the coast is at risk to coastal flooding, particularly as a result of sea level rise. And there are instances where some areas are at significant risk of compound flooding. So that's coastal flooding and also estuarine flooding within the same region. So I think, it's going to be a really quite concerning time, particularly for the rail industry, and how we make sure that our network are as resilient as they can be in the future years to come.
God, thank you for such a full first answer. Brian, can you follow on from that and add to what Hayley's said, and what are your sort of concerns?
Sure. I think the kind of impact upon the system is probably that I'm much more focused on, rather than individual asset types or groups. And I think one of the things that we're really quite honest about in the network, certainly in Network Rail, is that we don't fully understand the impact of weather upon much of our assets, certainly not as a system of systems. We do understand the linear relationship between heat and critical rail temperature, for example, or the things that Hayley pointed out there about overhead line equipment and the impact on the catenary wires, etc. They're fairly basic physics, but our line side neighbours and the relationship between adjacent land and the impact on our network is an incredibly non-linear complex problem. And it's something that we are looking at hugely with the Weather Advisory Task Force under Dame Julia Slinger at the moment, with the Met Office and also Newcastle University. But you couldn't underestimate the complexity of trying to understand the impact. Now, the key for me about resilience isn't spending billions of pounds on the rail infrastructure to make it resilient to the long-term impacts of weather. It's actually providing a resilient timetable for our passengers and freight users to keep them safe. And there will always be a compromise between that and train performance. But that's something that we need to sort of discuss in the future. But to become really resilient, it's about planning around timetable and passenger movements.
Gosh, actually listening to all that, Tim, it really does sound like it is about planning, and it's quite terrifying to realise that the challenge is, that you're all facing in your area of the industry. Can you just follow on from your just initial thoughts, Tim, before we get it into a bit of a deeper dive on certain subjects?
Yeah, so I might add to the complexity and the challenge here a little bit, because actually then from a policy point of view and from a broader transport planning point of view, particularly here in the north of England, we face a number of challenges, and one of those is about the resilience of the network, actually, and the very limited options particularly for east-west connectivity on a rail network which is largely driven, as Hayley alluded to, really by Victorian view of where railways needed to go. And still very dependent on Victorian infrastructure in many parts of the North Rail network. So we already have sort of reliability and resilience issues in our neck of the woods, and that's likely to increase through climate change. But at the same time, what we need to do is strengthen the markets for rail, particularly across the north, particularly because parts of the north still remain very car dependent. And what we want to do is strengthen both the economic linkages between places and to see mode shift, both for passengers and freight. So we've also got a sort of policy challenge in the wider context of both levelling up and decarbonisation, to see a much more strengthened public transport network, both within places and between places in the north of England. So how we balance all of that really is a big challenge for the whole industry.
And Tim, is that, particularly in the north where you are, is that mode shift happening, do you think?
Well, part of the reason why Transport for North was created was because it was recognised that the connectivity between, particularly between the economic centres of the north of England, isn't good enough, and therefore, particularly for public transport and specifically for rail, and that's partly why TfN has focused so heavily on major rail investment between places, particularly in the Thorn and Northern Powers Rail, precisely because that is the route to having a much stronger level of connectivity, but one in which also enables us to decarb the transport network at the same time. It seems as though only really an electrified rail network offers both the opportunity for mass transit between cities and to achieve clean growth at the same time. But having answered the question, I think we do see those opportunities in the longer term. But at the moment, our rail network, certainly pre-pandemic, has been extremely constrained in terms of the service offer that it can offer, and particularly the point that Brian made about mixed-use traffic on the network actually then really reduces our ability to offer as many services as we want to, particularly through the kind of key hubs that are big bottlenecks for us.
The Met Office is looking to project climatic changes, well, certainly through to 2080, I've seen, and potentially further. Hannah, Hayley, what is the industry doing to respond to those challenges that you outlined so eloquently in your first answer?
Well, what we're planning to do at Transport for Wales is we're going to be developing an adaptation plan, so that will be published next year. And the focus will be on our core Valley Lines network, but we're also responsible for our public bus service within the valleys in Wales, and active travel as well. I think it's really crucial that detailed risk assessments are undertaken in the field. So I will be working very closely with our engineering teams to conduct those risk assessments, and because they're the ones, they're experts in the field. I'm not an engineer. So we will be working very closely together to ensure that we identify the solutions that are needed. But also that the aim of the plan is to ensure that climate risk and adaptation is embedded in everything that we do within policy, projects. We need to ensure that whatever we are planning to do corporately has that assessment of climate risk in mind. And also, I will be looking at ensuring that adaptation solutions are identified where applicable for our bus networks and active travel, because the aim is to foster an integrated, sustainable transport network. And you can't silo this. It needs to be done in the round. So that is our intention. This is what we're planning to do. And I believe Network Rail, obviously Brian will talk more about this in detail, but they've already got a really in-depth weather resilience and climate change adaptation plan, and then individual bespoke plans for different regions across their network. So part of the Transport for Wales services actually does run on the Network Rail network. So we will be working quite closely together. But I think overall, in terms of adaptation across the UK, across all industry, it is quite slack at the moment. I know the government have been picked up on this. So the Environment Agency have recently wrote a report which says that more needs to be done. So I think, that we definitely need to be stepping up the ante when it comes to making sure that risk and adaptation is actually implemented, and implemented soon as well.
Be great to hear about that plan in a second that Hayley referred to, Brian, but let's just talk weather. Can you give us an indication of how the railway currently manages weather and seasonality, and how it uses forecast information to make operational decisions?
Sure. So seasonality and managed quite separately within not just Network Rail, but the rail industry. Seasonality, you mentioned autumn of the leaves on the line. For years, we've rolled over plans, we've tweaked, and we've learned lots of lessons. But seasonal planning is a very mature process within the rail industry. And it's managed through a proper assurance process at level 1, 2, and 3, with independent review at the 3rd level. That happens way in advance of the season itself. And that's everything from individual delivery units, the people that are responding to these things, making sure the basic kit's there, the checks there, etc., right down to the actual processes. Weather management's we manage weather basically through our 2 to 5 day forecast. We have in Network Rail, and it's not just Network Rail, because all the train operators have also got logins to this site, Network Rail Weather Services site. We've got a dedicated weather forecast provider, and they've co-developed decision support tools set to our standard thresholds for individual asset types for many years now. And we've made incremental changes to that, including a number of cases of bespoke forecasting tools. So, for example, overtopping tools for the seawall at Dawlish, for example, would be a classic. There's lots of other things, including overhead line icing, conductor rail icing, to adhesion forecasting. So those bespoke tools, but in the actual weather management itself, the forecast provider, we have a 2 to 5 day process for extreme weather events. And obviously, depending on the confidence level against the forecast, it sets off a whole 5-stage process that actually starts with BAU, business as usual, right through to just being aware and watch. And that's basically reviewing the information that's coming to enhancing things around control centers, to stage 2 at prepare, which is about the sort of T-3 days out. Then conference calls will happen with delivery units. We'll make sure that we promulgate all the DU actions and notes. They're checked. The weather forecast is continuously monitored. And then, of course, we've got stage 3, response. And, to be fair to the rail industry at large, we've had a couple of 100 years to get good at responding and recovery, which is stage 4. And at stage 5 is the review and feedback. If I'm totally honest, the transformation that the rail industry needs to undertake is that the focus at stage 3, 4, and 5, which is about response and recovery, which we are very good at, we need to be doing the equal amount of resource and planning at stage 0, 1, and 2. That's the transformation, and there's no doubt about that needs to happen. So yeah, hopefully I've answered that question. But yeah,
I think you have, and I suppose it's about making the railway safe and seasonally agnostic, isn't it? But Hayley gave you a great introduction into your plan. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, so the weather risk climate change adaptation plan, Hayley's really stolen my thunder, because they're route specific plans that are built with the delivery units, the route asset managers, and they are a series of plans that are about the long-term resilience of the railway. And the key to it is to build resilience in continuously. But as I said, if I'm slightly critical here, we, as an engineering focused company, which we are, there is a lot of focus on that rather than the systems of systems that I'm trying to develop as part of the operational tools. Because actually some of these things, we mentioned resilience, there's a lot of definitions of resilience, as we all know. But for me, agnosticism, as the rail industries have adopted for the 10-year strategy in the ops space, is actually about service level provision. It's not about making these asset groups hugely resilient. There's no doubt that could be done, but that's going to need a completely different way of thinking about it, and a huge investment. As we know, we've got 190,000 earthworks at risk at the moment. Just to spend on that to make them, safe is going to be difficult enough. So actually, the long-term resilience about the provision of train service to make it safe for the passenger.
Let's talk about net zero decarbonisation, Tim. How will Transport for the North work with local and national partners to achieve net zero? And also, when do you think we're going to start to see some significant results?
Yeah, so we've over the last year, we've been developing the first pan-northern decarbonisation strategy, and we've been consulting on that over the spring, and that's had a really positive response. And it's a plan that's been agreed by all northern leaders and will be hopefully formally adopted by the Transport for the North Board at the end of the year. That sets a very clear trajectory towards achieving net zero by emissions on surface transport by 2045, slightly ahead of where the government's transport decarbonisation plan comes out in 2050. But I think whether you're talking about national or regional, the challenges here are enormous. We saw some of that in what the government published this week. I think the big challenges for us are, as I said earlier, actually there is an investment question here. I think the sort of the long-term underinvestment in the North Rail network, and in particular delays in electrification, as I said, particularly around sort of key hubs like Manchester, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, those kind of key bottlenecks on the network actually electrification is long overdue. We're in a slightly strange time in rail in the north, because we're on the verge of waiting for the government's integrated rail plan for the Midlands of the North. We've been waiting a little while, and we're hoping it's imminent, and it will give us the clarity both on HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail. But actually, within all that investment planning, the one thing that comes through consistently across all the different ranges of options for future investment is around electrification. And we're working with Network Rail particularly on electrification plans, and I do think electrification is a particularly critical element. And actually in the response on decarbonisation through the statutory consultation has been that one of the big things that has come back as what are the big immediate actions where things need to change and change quite quickly. And so I think there's lots of other stuff I could talk about here, but actually it's now the commitment to and starting a rolling integrated programme of electrification across the north and the Midlands as well, for that matter. That really is the thing that I think certainly in the next phase, in the early to mid 2020s, becomes the thing that can actually start to provide the foundations of a really coherent public transport network across the north of England. Lots of other investment needed too, particularly in local connectivity and having decarbonised integrated public transport networks, particularly within city regions. And you see lots of places across the north moving very quickly to decarbonise different elements of that, and to have quite ambitious plans in places for light rail and mass transit. But actually, this only really comes together, as Hayley said earlier, as an integrated, coherent approach.
Hayley, moving on to you, it'd be interesting to see where Transport for Wales is, but also, can decarbonisation commitments pose extra risks to the rail industry?
Absolutely. So the latest risk assessment of climate risk that was published in August this year, and it has been identified that actually net zero commitments increase our exposure to risk. Now, what I mean by that is through a sort of mass electrification program. So we're relying on, as a nation, for electrification to solve all our transport needs at the moment in terms of on-road transport, our rail, our buses, and we're also trying to move towards electrified heating in our homes as well. So when the government recently announced funding for heat pumps, they will require electricity to be able to power them. So all this is going to be putting extra pressure on our grid networks, who are also moving towards a renewable way of producing energy. Now, with the risks that I mentioned earlier, so those climatic impacts, so with more intense frequent storms, high winds, thunder and lightning, flooding, all those particular climate drivers will put extra pressure on our grid networks. So if you have a completely electrified rail system, there is a possibility that you could have no running services at all because the grid network is down because of power outages. So there is a way in which actually through those particular decarbonisation commitments, your exposure and vulnerability to those risks as we progress through the course of the century will actually increase. So, I mean, in my opinion, I think it's better to look at a suite of solutions. So electrification, battery and hydrogen as a way of which to look at powering our trains in the future. Hydrogen does come with a caveat though, because obviously there are different modes of hydrogen and there are sustainability concerns with how that is produced. So I think going forward, it needs to be taken with a different approach. And then lastly, I just want to mention about the sort of, obviously we want more people to be travelling on our trains. We want to encourage that modal shift, but there is a danger that you're also increasing our passengers' exposure to risk with overheating on trains. Now, in order to resolve that, we'll be using air conditioning, but if we are using air conditioning on our trains, that's going to put more pressure on batteries and also electrification as well. So yeah, it's where decarbonisation is the way forward to reduce emissions. It does also come with quite concerning risks as well.
Brian, you went nodding away there on lots of things Hayley was saying. Again, she's set you up very nicely for your answer. Extra pressure on the grid, a different approach needed. Do you want to just pick up from what Hayley said and talk about where you're at Network Rail with all of this?
Absolutely. So I think Hayley's spot with the whole idea that mass electrification is the single answer. I can't see that. The operational risks with 25,000 volts just in the winds we currently have are a nightmare. We delay passengers by thousands of minutes every year because of problems with the overhead line equipment. And of course, we've got legacy equipment out there. They're not 200 years old, but some of them are getting pretty old. There's lots of different types of overhead line equipment. Some of them in very vulnerable locations in regards to wind. And not only that, as Hayley said, the maintenance of these things can't be done remotely. Overhead line equipment requires staff. It requires lots of people going to it. So I think a suite or a basket of ideas, especially around the hydrogen thing and biomode, is extremely important. You can't electrify the whole network anyway. You couldn't electrify some parts of the network. It just wouldn't happen. Certainly on some of the branch lines and some of those lines that are being reintroduced that Dr. Beecham, closed many years ago. I think if we're going to see that transport shift, then that modal shift, then there has to be a number of options. It can't be clearly overhead line equipment. And of course, the other problem as well is that our green corridors and our 20,000 miles of track is really important to all that biodiversity. Trees and overhead line and wind don't mix.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. They certainly don't. Tim, you've been consulting with the public over the summer on your plans, and it's always great to get out there, isn't it, and talk to the public, talk to the passengers, because obviously they're the heart of our rail network. I'm just wondering what sort of reaction you got, what sort of things they said, and what interesting points they brought up when you were doing that consultation process.
Yes, it's been a great experience, I have to say. And as I said, there's a number of challenges in the North Transport Network, so actually it's been really good to sort of get out and sort of talk to people about all this. And clearly, sort of the COVID and travel behaviours having changed and working patterns having changed have shaped some of what we've heard, but actually there's lots of support for early action, particularly on decarbonisation. And I said earlier, the big things that really come through is actually the strong focus on having a regional plan. I think, to be frank, we weren't entirely clear to an extent whether there was real value and support for a need for a regional approach to decarbonisation, because so much of the policy levers around this are either at national level in terms of delivery bodies and government, and at local level, particularly around active travel and local transport. But actually, lots of support for a regional approach to all this, and a recognition that actually there is we need regional route maps really for transport decarbonisation that can adjust to different places, but actually there's a scale of activity. And as I said earlier, a really strong focus on creating a regional public transport network, one that can both unlock opportunity for people across the north of England, but also decarbonise. And just to touch on the sort of the mode shift point a little bit about integrate. The more we can get to a more integrated approach to all of this, including it happens on the road network, the interaction with sort of HTV, on the shift between road to rail on freight. Equally, these discussions about fuels and alternative approaches. There's just a bigger conversation to have about HGVs as there is to have about rail too. So actually, yeah, the more we can get to an integrated cross-modal regional approach, the better. And oddly, that is across all the things that we've asked the public about. What would they like to see happen? There's obviously a huge appetite now for early action, for investment, but also on that having a more joined up approach, and an approach that works for passengers as well. I think it's really...
We're just about out of time, but there's a quick question that's dropped in the inbox from Michael. Michael says, for passenger trains, alternative energy systems such as batteries and hydrogen are feasible. However, as discussed in, it's jumped now, hang on a second. As discussed in previous sessions, electrification is the only viable current technology to decarbonise long-distance freight services. How can these freight services be made resilient to extreme weather if they become dependent on overhead electrification? Brian, is that something you can take?
I can't. I'm not a fleet engineer, and I'd never pretend to be. But that there are a number of different designs for pantographs, certainly from other countries, that we know are more robust than some of the systems we have in the UK. So I'm sure there's a lot of learning from not just Europe, but other countries around the world for exactly that. I think that one of the biggest shifts will be the current fleet arrangement for freight is obviously hugely, massively tilted towards the diesel locomotives, but that will be a huge transition, but will have to happen. So yeah, I'm sure there's options for that. Yeah, and
Hayley,
it's not just the fleet as well. It's the interface issue between the contact between the wire and the pantograph. If you've got a robust OLE system like you have in Great Western, because it's pretty new, and then you've got good solid trains with good design, then you should be okay. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for taking that. Hayley, we've just got time for one final thought. What support's needed from government to increase the resilience of the rail and the transport infrastructure? I mean, it always boils down to finance, really, doesn't it, on funding, but what support do you think we need?
Well, the Committee on Climate Change have recently indicated that because of current adaptation plans that are in place, the rail industry is at increasing risk of surface and river flooding. So, what we're planning to do at Transport for Wales is look at natural solutions first and foremost, where applicable. So there may be some areas that we can allow to naturally flood and use as attenuation drainage areas. However, natural solutions might not be the best case in all scenarios. So we might need to resort to hard engineering solutions. Now, the likelihood is that those solutions are going to be extremely expensive in cost, running into hundreds of millions of pounds. Where does that money come from? So we need to have some sort of investment agreement to support the rail industry, put those solutions in so that we can ensure that our rail network is safe and resilient for our passengers in years to come. If we want more people to be using the railway, it needs to be operable. So, and we need to be able to safeguard that. And we need to not be reactive. So we need to actually prepare accordingly. And then finally, I think, as I alluded to it earlier, we are sort of increasing exposure to risks of cascading failures, particularly from the infrastructure owners that we are dependent on. So as we do move towards electrification, we are going to be dependent upon a resilient grid network. Now that that resilience needs to come through careful planning and also engineering works as well to ensure that those grid networks are able to withstand the capacity loading as we move towards electrification for everything, but also be able to sustain those occurrences of extreme events when they happen. And again, I think that we need to have more support from government in order to create this sort of collaborative effort that is very vital. And then lastly, I think what is really going to be important is research and innovation. So as Brian and I sort of discussed earlier, it's our opinion that we think a basket of solutions are needed and not just relying on electrification. So I think more R&D does need to be done to look at those solutions and whether there are any viable alternatives, particularly for freight. But that needs to be, again, led and supported by the government.
I fibbed because I'm going to squeeze in one more quick question. And I'm hoping I'll get a volunteer to take this. It is a question for all speakers, but we've just got time for one of you to answer. Jaffney says, would it be possible to design and use clean energy solutions for rail traction purpose? If so, are there any companies or individual experts you can recommend? Any volunteers for that?
I couldn't answer that, to be honest.
No. Tim, is that anything you could answer? Hayley?
No.
No, not really.
Possibly contact the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. They may not actually have such a project in development, but they may be able to point you to the right person.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you to Jaffney for posing that question. Thank you to all of you, all of the panelists. Fantastic discussion to come back to. And it's encouraging to see just how much work is going into adapting to climate change, and the array of solutions out there mean hopefully it's not all doom and gloom. Right now, it's time to break for lunch and a chance for you to unwind. If you get time, jump into the meeting hub and continue to gain connections and build your community with your fellow delegates, or chat further to those you've already met. I hope our 3 panels this morning have given you food for thought and perhaps some topics to break the ice. The connections you build now are there for you to use into the future, logging in at your leisure and exchanging views with not just the delegates here today, but future registrants too, building your community. Our speakers can offer you plenty of knowledge, but a significant source of knowledge on our platform comes from each and every one of you. So do feel free to share your insights too. A reminder, we have a great and rewarding prize for those fully taking advantage of community building. Those in first, second and third places will get to donate in their name to the Magic Breakfast or More Trees. Let's meet back at 2 o'clock for our afternoon session and next panel discussion. Have a good break, and I'll see you then.